In most parts of your life, you spend a lot of time predicting what's going to happen. You don't even need to do this consciously. Your brain actually does it for you. For example, if you walk into a restaurant, you have a prediction of what it's going to vaguely look like. You understand how it's going to be roughly laid out. You mostly are not spending your life constantly surprised and shocked and bewildered by everything you see. Most of your life, most of the things that you experience are more or less what you expect them to be. The predictive quality of your brain, that ability to predict what's going to happen, is one of the most important things. You use it all the time. One of the main places you actually use it is in reading. Most of the time, when you're reading most things, your brain is actively predicting what's going to happen, and it's doing it pretty accurately. If you're reading a news article, you basically know what's coming. You know what's going to happen as you go. If you're reading a story, you know what's going to happen more or less within some kind of a range. For example, if you're reading a story about dragons, you don't expect there to suddenly be, something from modern life in there, unless that's the way that it's set up. If you're reading a story about Abraham Lincoln, you don't expect there to be suddenly a dragon in that story. So again, you're always predicting what's reasonable to see. You have a very powerful ability to do that. That can go actually extremely far. If you look at the screen right now, you'll see this thing where the words are jumbled up nonsense, but your mind can still read it fine. Your mind can predict the word itself. Just even with some vague jumble, you can pretty much be like, yeah, here's what this basically means. You're able to read total gibberish just fine. That's how powerful that predictive ability of your mind is. Now, here's the thing about tests like the SAT, the ACT, the GMAT, the GRE, LSAT, the MCAT, all of these tests that have reading passages on them, they're always going to give you questions and passages that are going to make that predictive reading simply not work. That predictive reading that you do most of the time simply will not work. Instead, they're testing something else, a skill that you realistically rarely use. We call that skill analytical reading. Let's take a look at some of these words. These are some words that might be unfamiliar to you. And when you look at these words, what happens? Your brain kind of slows down and starts analyzing the word. It sounds it out. Normally, when you look at a word, you're not really sounding it out. That's why when you look at this sentence, if you try to sound it out, it doesn't work. You'd be saying, egg. But if you just kind of predict what it means, you can say, according to a research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are, etc. So you can see it totally fine, but if you try to sound this out, it won't work. When you switch into analytical reading, you're going to automatically start sounding it out, start figuring out how these pieces fit together. Now, what's true for words is also true for sentences. Most of the time, when you look at a sentence, your brain starts to predict what it's basically going to say. It's going to predict the next sentence and the sentence after that. That's why many people can read simple things so quickly, because they've basically already predicted the whole thing, and all they're doing is just confirming that what they thought it was going to say is what it actually does say. If a news article says, the president passed a new tax cut, you basically expect that that's what the passage is going to be about. The news article will be that the president passed a new tax cut. And you can read it very quickly. Now, maybe somewhere in there, it turns out that there's some other surprising thing, and then at that point, your brain will slow down and start picking that up. Now, on the SAT, predictive reading will not work. So instead of using the skills that you normally rely on, understanding of the world, understanding of how things usually how things usually kind of come together, on the SAT, you're going to have to use primarily analytical reading. You'll still use a little predictive reading. It's going to be mostly analytical. And so that means you're going to work on things that you don't usually associate with reading. You're going to work a lot on grammar. You know why? Analytical reading is hugely based on grammar. You're going to work a lot on logic, because analytical reading depends heavily on logic. You're going to be using these tools that you probably never even thought had anything to do with reading, because you're using actually a different skill. Analytical reading is a very, very different skill from predictive reading. I want to use an analogy. You've probably watched a movie at some point in your life, and because human beings are kind to each other, because we are used to predicting ourselves and we help other people predict, in a movie, if something good is going to happen, you can predict it just by listening to the music. If the music gets all upbeat and uplifting, something good is going to happen. Now, if the SAT makers were going to make a movie, that would never work. Good music would happen with like a bad event. Bad music would happen with something good. It would be very, very hard to follow. It would be very disorienting. That's what the SAT will often be like. The ideas will be unexpected. The sentences will say something different from what you expect. What you predict is probably not going to be what it actually says. So we're going to be developing these totally different tools that let us use something other than predictive reading and instead use analytical reading. I want to close by having you look at one exercise. It's the 2 dots exercise. We use it in our speed reading classes. You'll see it in some of the philosophy worksheets. Here's how it basically works. You see there's these 2 dots on this screen. What you need to do is you cover up, say, your right eye, and then you look at the right dot. So you cover your right eye and look at the right dot with your left eye. And you basically move your face closer and farther from the screen, and at some point, the dot that you're not looking at is going to disappear. Here's why that happens. In your brain, something interesting is happening, which is that the actual place where the optic nerve connects to the eye. So this is the back, this is the front of the eye here, and there's your pupil. Here in the back, the optic nerve connects. All along the back of your eye, you have photoreceptors, taking in light, turning it into information. But right here where the optic nerve connects, there are no photoreceptors in that tiny spot. It's called the blind spot. Your brain is always filling in that blind spot. It's always predicting what's there. Now, in the case of these 2 dots, it predicts wrong. You can make it predict wrong on purpose, time after time after time. You put that left green dot in the blind spot, and you won't be able to see it. So even as good as your brain is at predicting, it can still make an error. And the SAT is going to try to trip your brain up in every way possible. So get used to a really, really different approach to reading. You're going to be doing grammar, logic, stuff you've never thought about before, and I promise you it's going to supercharge your analytical reading. It's going to help you dominate the SAT, the GRE, the ACT, GMAT, LSAT, MCAT. All these skills depend on analytical reading.